Doug. He is probably familiar to many of you, and so I'm going to keep it very brief. I first encountered Doug Henwood at one of the big Rethinking Marxism conferences over in Amherst. They don't do them as regularly anymore, but they were doing them quite regular for a while. And Mike Davis had been brought in to be a keynote speaker, and he bailed, as he often does. And Doug was sort of called into action to deliver one of the keynote addresses to a large group of people. And I was immediately impressed with both the fact that he could just on the fly come up, a day later, come up with a keynote address, but also the sort of clarity of thinking, the humor, the ability to speak coherently on a range of issues was something. And that night I was at dinner with, among others, Ruthie Gilmore, and she said, "Yeah, I subscribe to everything, but the only thing that I read cover to cover is the Left Business Observer." And I thought, oh well, shit, I should get on this bandwagon. If I don't know if any of you know Ruth. She wrote The Golden Gulag and has been a sort of a long time activist in the Bay Area and everywhere else. But when she speaks, I always listen. And it was at that point that I started trying to read Doug's work systematically. His book, After the New Economy, was important for me when I was writing my dissertation and then book afterwards. He's the author of Wall Street, which was also really helpful for me. And more recently, My Turn, which is the book that he came up here to talk about a couple years ago in the lead up to the 2016 presidential election, which has left us with Donald Trump as our president. I have, I think, listened to every single episode of Behind the News since then. I listen to it religiously. It has become a sort of part of my political landscape. I go for 6 months without listening, and then I just go back and binge my podcast way forward. It's great. Yasha Levine, who's coming, was a guest on Doug Henwood. Alex Vitale, who was here a couple months ago, was someone who I first heard about from Doug's show. He has regular guests, talking about Brazilian economic and political. Alfredo Salfilo talking about the politics of Brazil. Vijay Prashad talking about the Middle East. Folks talking about mass incarceration. Folks talking about sex work. Folks talking about you name it. The range of topics is quite astonishing. The long series of interviews with Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister, were fascinating. But it's not just the diversity of topics, it's the kind of coherent political analysis, the framework of a critical engagement with our contemporary moment that underpins all of Doug's work, which makes the show so wonderful to sort of keep up with. And if you're not tuned into this podcast, you really ought to be. Behind the News, you can get it through all the regular mechanisms and find all the back episodes on the web. He's a sane leftist. There aren't always that many of them. Deeply learned in all sorts of ways, has a literary background, which makes me particularly affectionate for him. His previous days dabbling in 19th century American lit, but a sort of thoughtful left Marxist analysis that has reasonable arguments around the state, around mass movement politics, around the range of issues facing us today. You'll find few observers more coherent as an analyst of the present moment. So please join me in welcoming Doug Henwood.
Hello, thanks to all of you for coming out to this double-barreled religious holiday. As a militant secularist myself, I don't always pay attention to such events, but perhaps I should. I'm going to talk for, maybe about 20 minutes or so, and then do the Q&A, because no one wants to listen to me go on for all that long. But I'll just start by saying it's really hard to think clearly about Donald Trump. In his little book on television, the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu wrote that warned against the twin temptations of historical analysis. Everything is totally changed and unlike anything that ever went before, and the other one is nothing has changed over the last 1,000 years. Nowhere are these two temptations as visible as they are in the field of Trump studies. You've got a large set of critics screaming that he's our Hitler, or if you're a Russophobe, our Putin, a violator of all the ethical norms of high office. And then there's a hearty band of Facebook ultra-leftists, less numerous than the alarmists, who assure us that Trump is little different from Obama. The deportation numbers are down, although there's some technicalities involved. Is it too distressingly moderate of me to say that there's more continuity to Trump than the screamers say, but that he does mark a turn for the worse? People who talk about the dignity of the presidency mustn't think much about Richard Nixon, a far more interestingly twisted character than the one-dimensional Trump. Nixon ran a private spying operation and bombed Cambodia in total secrecy. His drunken ravings caused a frightened Henry Kissinger, co-architect of those secret bombings, and Alexander Haig to hide the nuclear football from him. I used to say that Kelly, McMaster, and Mattis probably have a similar arrangement with Trump, but McMaster, who bored Trump and looked to him like a beer salesman, is out, and Kelly's term in office looks somewhat tenuous. Trump's horrendous xenophobia, shocking by recent standards, has a lot in common with the nativism of the late 19th, the Palmer raids and McCarthyism, though Trump has fallen well short of those so far. And no one is shooting strikers now the way we did in the 19th century, though that may be because there are so few strikers. I don't think the US has become so depraved that it will mow down teachers just yet. But everything does feel worse. Policy aside, there's no question that Trump is a bare expression of the worst of the American political id. He's encouraged the most horrible sorts of people, Nazis, white supremacists, clash of civilization types, to be far more open and violent. ICE's war on immigrants and the targeted roundup of immigrant leaders is vicious and terrifying. Nuclear war has become something that people casually talk about. Millions will lose health care, national monuments will give way to uranium mines, and the climate will go to hell at an accelerating rate. Trump himself is ignorant and aimless, but there are enough right-wing thugs around him to do a lot of very serious damage. This is all only accelerating a long-term decline in the quality of American life, but an acceleration it is. Where did it come from? For a full understanding, of course, we'd have to go back to the founding of this country and slavery and Indian genocide. But for the purpose of this talk, it's probably simpler to start in the 1970s, though we should never lose sight of the founding stories. In popular caricature, the 1970s are remembered as the decade of disco, leisure suits, and stagflation. I like disco, although I thought the fashion was indeed appalling. But the political economy was actually far more interesting than it gets retrospective credit for. The first half of the decade featured the first oil shock, the US losing the Vietnam War, and as Jefferson Cowie shows in his book, Staying Alive, the spread of the rebellious 60s spirit from the campuses into the broad working class. There were wildcat strikes, especially early in the decade, including one against the Postal Service that led to Nixon calling out the National Guard to deliver the mail. There was sabotage in the assembly lines. The financial markets performed miserably. Corporate profitability fell from its mid-1960s peaks. Elites worried about the blue-collar blues, and when compounded by demands from the Third World oil and other resource producers for a global redistribution, the elites felt anxious about a loss of control. As the decade progressed, Samuel Huntington and the Trilateralists worried about an excess of democracy, and they wanted a lot less of it. Facing profound threats to their power, the ruling class began to organize a counter-revolution. In 1971, future Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell, then a corporate lawyer in Richmond, wrote a famous memo suggesting a massive ideological offensive against the threats to the rule of capital. Sometimes too much weight is placed on that Powell memo, but it was an early sign of upper-class mobilization. A year later, Fortune 500 CEOs founded the Business Roundtable to lobby for more profit-enhancing policies. The right in particular, which had been moribund for much of the post-World War II decades, found fresh energy and new members. Think tanks were formed and older ones were energized. By the end of the decade, Jimmy Carter was pushing deregulation and balanced budgets. Perhaps most fatefully of all, Carter appointed Paul Volcker to run the Federal Reserve. Volcker, who took office in October 1979, saying that the standard of living in America must decline, promptly drove interest rates up towards 20%, and that was the end of Jimmy Carter. Ronald Reagan began his presidency in the midst of the worst recession since the 1930s. He then fired the striking air traffic controllers, setting in motion a broad war on organized labor. At the same time, Wall Street was launching its own class war from above. In the decades after the 1929 stock market crash, finance was deeply discredited. Shareholders had nothing to do with the companies that they technically owned. Though since the economy was performing well in the 50s and 60s, they really had not much to complain about. But with the deterioration in profitability and financial market performance in the 1970s, the mood of the financier class soured considerably. As the 70s turned into the 80s, the owning class began to assert itself more directly. Most importantly for this story, the period saw the rise of takeover artists, who using gobs of borrowed money would launch attacks on what were seen as underperforming companies. The aim was to take them over, slim them down, and then raise profitability. The formula typically involved layoffs, pay cuts, speed up, union busting, pension fund raids, and big payments to the buyout artists. And the creation of a whole new set of fortunes, by the way, which was pretty important. At the center of all this was Michael Milken of the now defunct investment banking firm Drexel Burnham Lambert. The theorist of the movement, Harvard Business School professor Michael Jensen, declared that it all represented the end of the public corporation, one that is owned by outside shareholders, and its replacement by privatized companies owned by a small group of investors in partnership with senior management. The idea was that the debt required to fund these transformations would concentrate managerial minds, forcing them to cut costs, sell lagging divisions, and raise returns for shareholders. Things didn't turn out quite as planned. As the roaring 80s turned into the recessionary early 90s, the takeover movement fell apart. Milken entered a federal prison, and the taken over companies often collapsed under enormous debt burdens. It looked like the public corporation was not being eclipsed after all. But after a hibernation, that takeover movement returned to life in the early 2000s, more respectable perhaps than the Drexel days, in the form of large private equity funds. The private equity funds are vast pools of money provided by institutions and rich individuals, run by a small team of managers. Although they sometimes start companies or fund new ones in their early stages, more typical is buying an existing company, using the partnership's own funds as equity, and again, gobs of borrowed money for the rest. The formula for success is also similar to the 1980s. Sell divisions, cut costs, outsource, speed up. And then maybe you load up the firm with debt and pay yourself big cash dividends and consulting fees. Then you sell the taken over firm a few years later, either to another private equity firm or to a competitor, or on occasion to the public through a stock market flotation. As a result of this wave of buyouts over the last 15 years or so, the number of listed companies, those whose stock is traded in a public exchange, has declined by half over the last couple of decades. The value of those companies has risen with the relentless bull market of the last 8 years, but they're still dominated by older firms. A striking feature of the boom in startups we've seen recently, the venture capital funded creation of so-called unicorns, those startups worth $1 billion or more, names like Uber and Airbnb, is how few of these firms have gone public. Uber is talking about floating stock in 2019, but that's an eternity in financial time, and Uber itself is looking pretty wobbly these days. The reason for this staying private rather than going public as they would have in an earlier era looks to be not wanting the bother of public shareholders telling you what to do or having to disclose your finances every quarter. Although the typical structure of a private equity firm is that of a limited partnership, a small circle of very well-heeled friends, one of the biggest, the Blackstone Group, went public in 2007, just before everything fell apart. The stock lost about 85% of its value over the next couple of years, but has since recovered, is now actually trading above its offering price. You'd still have done 5 times as well just buying an S&P index fund. Not only has the financial performance of Blackstone been underwhelming, as a stockholder you'd have no claim to much of anything. As the prospectus of their stock offering made clear, our common holders will only have limited voting rights and have no right to elect our general partner or its directors. Blackstone's partners made a ton of money from the offering, but their shareholders haven't. This is, among other things, further proof of the old rule that you should never buy anything from someone richer than yourself. Along with the growth of private equity, we've seen an increasing prominence of private companies. The most notorious of these is Koch Industries, owned by the people who spent well over $1 billion transforming the American political landscape over the last couple of decades. This is all interesting from the narrowly economic point of view. How corporations are owned and run is of great importance for our material welfare. But it's also politically and sociologically very interesting. I'd say that the rightward move of the Republican Party has been greatly lubricated by the increasing wealth and political engagement of these private actors. They're all over government at every level, from state legislatures to the federal government. There are, as I already mentioned, the Koch brothers, who funded, mostly in great secrecy, hundreds of political candidates and scores of think tanks and institutes at universities. In their networks are many similarly constituted magnates. One of them, Harold Hamm, a fracking billionaire, is Trump's favorite advisor on energy policy. And there are buyout artists too. There's Steve Schwarzman of Blackstone, who is a Trump advisor. Schwarzman is the guy whose reaction to a half-hearted proposal by Obama to end a tax break enjoyed by the likes of Schwarzman was to liken it to Hitler's invasion of Poland. Trump's Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, who used to be a great favorite, but now I think is falling out of favor, is another one of these private equity guys. And Robert Mercer, the hedge fund billionaire, who funded the tech side of Trump's campaign, as well as Breitbart News and Cambridge Analytica, is also an important part of this Trump machinery. Trump himself ran a real estate firm with a small staff and no outside shareholders. Like a private equity guy, Trump loaded up his casinos with debt and pocketed much of the proceeds. You might think it's pretty hard to run a casino into the ground. The House does, after all, always win. But Trump managed to steer his into a ditch at great personal profit to himself. Although with him, you never really know for sure just how much money he has. What unites these guys, and they're almost all men, is that they don't want to answer to anyone other than their own money. Most of them are in very dirty industries and hate environmental regulations because they cost them lots of money or put them out of business. With the Koch brothers in the lead, but people like Harold Hamm, Trump's great friend, also one of these characters. Recently, the Financial Times had a story about how institutional investors were pressing public energy companies to begin accounting seriously for the fact that their business model is doomed and their assets could be worthless in the foreseeable future. Some of the energy companies are listening, or at least pretending to, but it's impossible to imagine David Koch or Harold Hamm taking this kind of advice. And so we have Trump and his EPA head, Scott Pruitt, dismantling every environmental regulation they can. This is a circle that doesn't merely want government cramping it's a circle that doesn't merely want government cramping its style. They also don't want outside investors bothering them either. This is all of great political importance, but there's also something of theoretical interest here too. Marx described the emergence of the corporation with the separation of ownership and management as the abolition of the capitalist mode of production within the capitalist mode of production itself, and hence a self-abolishing contradiction. The point is that if capitalists can hire outside managers, so could the working class. This process now looks like it's being thrown into reverse. The modest gains in transparency and accountability that have come with the public corporation and its disclosure requirements are being junked in favor of opacity and unchecked boss power. I suppose this is appropriate to a period of reaction, but it doesn't sound like a good development. This then is the class configuration behind Trump and the GOP. It does only represent a subset of the capitalist class so far. The broader, more establishment elites, Goldman Sachs, the Fortune 500, and the more cutting-edge ones around the Silicon Valley mostly preferred Hillary Clinton in 2016 and were afraid of Trump as dangerously unstable, which of course he is. But as soon as Trump made it clear that big tax cuts and deregulation were on the way, the corporate establishment came around, though the anti-immigrant and anti-import tendencies still make them a little nervous. Note that Goldman alum Gary Cohn left the administration not over Trump's defense of the Nazis who rioted in Charlottesville, but over the steel and aluminum tariffs. Those tariffs reveal a lot about Trump and his circle. It was sad to see some labor and labor-friendly people, like Ohio Senator Sherrod Brown and AFL-CIO President Richard Trumka, cheer Trump's decision to impose tariffs on imported steel and aluminum. They framed it as a just response to unfairness and cheating by foreign producers, which usually means China. That's really little different from Trump's rationale. Sherrod Brown's rhetoric had a combative aroma to it. If we fail to stand up for steel jobs today, China will come after other jobs up and down the supply chain tomorrow. Yellow peril is his lips. The tariffs are right for Trump, nationalistic, truculent, bombastic, but people who cherish international solidarity and humane social policies should think again. These tariffs will do little, if anything, to help the steel industry, could harm steel-using industries, will probably provoke retaliations that will leave everyone else worse off, and add a fresh dose of bellicosity to a world already overdosing on it. The European Union has announced intention to raise duties on red state products like peanut butter, Harleys, and bourbon. Announcing the measures, European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker said, "We can also do stupid. We have to be this stupid." China is also threatening retaliation. Soybean farmers feel like they're in the crosshairs. Whenever tariffs are in the news, mainstream commentators inevitably invoke the Smoot-Hawley tariff, the 1930 bill that almost universally is credited for helping make the Great Depression great by provoking a global trade war. These comparisons are way overdone, but Trump was characteristically wrong when he pronounced trade wars good and easy to win. It's not clear how Trump imagines victory in this fight. Let's take a look at the economics of the steel industry, an industry Trump equates with national greatness. If that's the measure, American greatness has been a long bear market. Back in 1958, the heart of an era that Trump seems to romanticize, steel accounted for less than 1% of total US employment. 20 years later, it was down to 0.5%, and that's before the deindustrialization of the 1980s brought us the term Rust Belt. Steel employment is now under 1/10 of 1% of total employment. But it's not like steel itself is disappearing. While steel performance is up by more than half over the last 25 years, the production of steel is up 18%. Productivity per hour of labor in the steel sector over the last 25 years rather, is up over 150%. Labor's share of value added in the industry fell from 23% in 1990 to 13% in 2015. In other words, the steel industry is doing okay. It's not booming, but it's solidly profitable, but steel workers are not doing well at all. And it's hard to see how these tariffs are going to change this in any meaningful way. We have some recent experience with steel tariffs, the ones imposed by George W. Bush in March 2002. Bush lifted them about a year and a half later under threat of retaliation by the EU and complaints by domestic steel users. During the 21 months they were in effect, steel employment fell by 9%, but production rose by 20%. There's evidence that steel-using industries like autos and appliances took a mild hit from the resulting higher prices. A survey by the U.S. International Trade Commission, an independent quasi-judicial branch of the federal government, found higher steel prices, at least for a while, that were hard to pass along and mildly increased difficulty in sourcing steel. Overall, the ITC estimated that tariffs resulted in a welfare loss economy-wide of $42 million, an almost immeasurably small amount by the standards of the U.S. economy. What this all means is that the steel tariffs did almost nothing good and hold the risks of doing something bad. In the case of Trump, they do add to the political ugliness that the Trump regime's stock in trade. But they also demonstrate something curious about Trump's political vision. Unlike earlier American presidents, Trump is not an apostle of a better world to come. He's given up on classic American optimism, which can be insufferably banal, don't get me wrong, and in favor of a sneering and vicious tone. There's none of Clinton's bridge to the 21st century or his annoying appropriation of Fleetwood Mac's Don't Stop Thinking About Tomorrow. While a lot of that was campaign con artistry, there's still something to be said for the general outlook. Trump is more interested in building a bridge to 1958, when steel and coal were king. It would make sense instead to develop an industrial future, one manufacturing the infrastructure of a clean energy and transportation system, for example, in the abandoned parts of the Midwest and South that are suffering from poverty, isolation, addiction, and early death. That would take major amounts of public investment and planning, things that Trump and his party are profoundly opposed to. That's what we should be pushing for, not cheering snake oil like tariffs. As I said earlier, in the early 1980s, Wall Street, the Federal Reserve, and the Reagan administration launched a war on the working class. It was highly successful. Income and wealth were transferred upwards, and labor nearly eliminated as a political and economic force. Corporate profitability was restored to levels not seen since the mid-1960s. But there was a contradiction in this agenda. In a society dependent on mass consumption, both for the maintenance of consumer demand and for political legitimation, squeezing the masses' living standards could have some seriously dislocating effects. For about 25 years, that contradiction was managed through easy borrowing, credit cards and mortgages. Household debt-to-income ratios rose relentlessly. That all broke apart in the crisis of 2008. Household debt levels fell for years and have yet to turn around. At the same time, despite the expansion of corporate profitability from the 90s onward and the rapid profit recovery from the financial crisis and the Great Recession, firms have not been investing in capital equipment. Instead, they've been shoving vast quantities of cash into their shareholders' pockets. And much of the recent round of tax cuts, whether we're looking at the Trump circle with its nostalgia for 1958, or more mainstream corporate financial elites, we see a ruling class that looks to have given up on the future. Maybe, given the climate crisis, they're onto something, but they all seem determined to make it all worse. In the face of this, National Democratic Party leadership is largely silent. They did little to fight the GOP's tax cuts. They're so busy demonizing Russia and personalizing everything to Trump that they're failing to articulate a compelling agenda of their own. They seem to be hoping that a revulsion against Trump will do the electoral trick for them in 2018 and 2020, just like it did for Hillary Clinton in 2016. Things are better at lower levels. Many Dem candidates for Congress, as well as state and local offices, are talking about protecting Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and even uttering the word single payer now. But big-name Dems, as well as liberal intellectuals like Paul Krugman and Katha Pollitt, are blathering incoherently about Putin and Trump's miserable personality. The reason for the reticence of elite liberals about policy may well be that, as Sanders showed, to win over a solid base would require a leftward turn towards things like single payer and free college, and their funders in Wall Street and the Fortune 500 don't like that sort of talk. I am trying hard to be more constructive these days, however. There is a bright spot. Of course, it might not surprise you to hear me say this, the West Virginia teachers' strike, which is now spreading to Kentucky, Oklahoma, and Arizona. It's fascinating that these uprisings have occurred in the so-called red states, although Arizona is more mixing them, where Republican budget savagery has done a lot of harsh work in recent years. And it's looking like teachers, along with nurses, are becoming the avant-garde of a new labor militancy, working in sectors that involve what Marxist feminists call social reproduction, taking care of people and preparing them for the world, rather than in basic industries. It's telling that national Democrats and union leaders have been silent in the face of this mobilization, and national union leaders were urging the teachers in West Virginia to settle, advice they fortunately ignored. This is inspiring indeed, and one of the few things I can think of now that are an antidote to despair. Thanks. Comments, questions? Yeah.
So I know Trump is largely incoherent and doesn't have a coherent thread to his policies or anything, but like, what's up with the threatening Amazon over taxes?
I think that's highly personal because Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post.
Oh, right.
And the Washington Post is very hostile to Trump, so Trump hates Bezos. Therefore, Trump wants to move against Amazon.
I thought maybe there was
it's not
some,
like he cares
like,
about local taxes
nationalistic.
or anything. No, I mean, he likes low wages, cheap prices.
All right.
But it's just, it's all personalities right now. I love Michael Wolff's Fire and Fury. I thought it's really a very well done, intelligent, and very funny book. But just every page you're reminded that this man knows absolutely nothing about anything.
Yeah.
A total ignoramus, who nonetheless has total confidence in his own genius. And it's really, one of the things I'm really trying to figure out is precisely how this guy, who has no real compelling political beliefs, I mean, he's full of hate and xenophobia, I can understand that. But he doesn't have what one would think of as a coherent political philosophy. Contrast Ronald Reagan for all his limitations. Reagan came out of movement conservatism and did actually have something like a political philosophy. Trump doesn't have that, but he's nonetheless surrounded himself with really hardcore right-wing ideologues. A lot of people out of the Koch network, and the cabinet secretaries, all really hard right people. And the people, he's kicking out all the vaguely mainstream people and surrounding himself with his nationalist buddies. But it's interesting how the vacuum that is Trump's head seems to have gotten filled with all these really hard right people.
Yeah.
Do you think Pence has anything to do with it?
Well, yeah, I think one of the things that Wolff says is that Trump, since he personalizes everything, he picks people to take care of things for him. So early in his administration, he decided he didn't know how to deal with Congress. He didn't know anything about fiscal policy. So, okay, I like Paul Ryan. Paul Ryan's okay. Paul Ryan can take care of political Congress and fiscal policy, and I don't have to think about that anymore. So I think, Pence, guy who's got a lot of experience, understands how to run a government, understands Congress, connected with the Koch networks. He's probably conducting a lot of the business. And Trump just watches TV all day. It's an appalling situation. People always blame me for, because I attacked Hillary and Liza. Spent a lot of time in 2015 and 16 attacking Hillary, but I blame her. It's not my fault.
Right.
Where do you think war fits into the Trump economic plan?
I think he might like one.
And his friends too.
He's an ignoramus, and he thinks things are really simple, and he thinks a trade war is simple, and I think he thinks that, we can just blow up North Korea, blow up Iran, there'd be no consequences, everything will be all over, and then everyone would love him and rally behind him. And all this political troubles will be over because we'd be in an orgy of patriotism. That thing that worked so well for both Bushes for a little while would perhaps work for him too. It's frightening that Mattis, who under normal circumstances would be seen as a pretty hawkish fellow, is actually a break on some of the crazier people in the administration. Now, that McMaster is out, and McMaster himself, not a hippie by any means. McMaster was frustrated that Mattis wasn't coming up with war plans against North Korea. And so here we are, it seems that Mattis may be one of the few things standing between us and some craziness with North Korea. Trump, of course, said he's going to have a meeting with Kim Jong-un. We'll see if that actually happens, if that gets derailed. But yeah, I'm sure Bolton would just like to turn both North Korea and Iran into parking lots. Though no, it's really scary stuff. Really, really scary stuff. The only hope is that they can't, that more rational forces will constrain him, but
The Arsenal's hiring across the river if anyone needs a job.
Oh, really? What do they do over there?
Cannons.
Cannons.
They
What
go
century is this?
20 miles. They hit Hudson with one of their howitzers.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's very useful. No.
The Waterloo Arsenal's hiring are making more cannons.
Go out, take one home and launch a war in New Jersey. Yeah.
All empires fall, and it just seems like the American U.S. empire is rapidly falling, and I don't know, we don't know when it will happen, but it just seems to be on this direction of chaos and crisis and possibly even nuclear war. I mean, what do you think about that? I mean, China is out there basically becoming the biggest economic country in the world. And I'm not advocating China because it's a dictatorship, but is this an aberration, or is this basically a continuation of where the U.S. empire has been headed for some time?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think I felt like the United States has been gradually decaying for several decades.
Yes.
But Trump has really accelerated the process.
Right.
We have part of what I was trying to get at in this paper, this talk, which I didn't really draw up more explicitly, is like I'm sort of been playing with this idea of writing a book on the rot of the American ruling class for some time, and it went from being I'll give the elevator speech version of it. We went from having a fairly coherent elite in the WASP era, when the northeastern WASPs ran the country basically, and for whatever their many shortcomings, racism among them, anti-Semitism, also a particular quirk of theirs. They did have a coherence as a social formation, an ability to think beyond the next election cycle or quarterly profit cycle, and a certain detachment from commerce and they had this ideology of stewardship. They're taking care of things for the next generation, and it was half bullshit, but it was half true as well. Now we have an elite that is just trying to make the most amount of money in the shortest possible amount of time and hang the consequences. And that's the faction that Trump really comes out of, this smash and grab, asset stripping culture that these private equity guys, these private companies, and their attitude towards the environment is perfectly symptomatic of this. The hell with it, let's just...
We don't have to break.
There's a line in a poem by A.R. Emmons, something like, I can't remember exact, but who wouldn't turn up the voltage when you know the lights are going out? That's usually the attitude of this crowd. They're just going to stuff their pockets as much as they can, and they don't care. And they can't, in contrast with that old WASP elite I was talking about, who managed to plan the emergence of the Great Depression, plan World War II, plan the entire post-World War II global order with considerable sophistication and skill, even if it was, an elite project. We don't have anything like that now. So you would think that a mature ruling class could say, this climate stuff is serious. We've got to do something. But no, they can't. They don't want to because, I don't know, it's for pansies or something. On the other hand, you mentioned China. China is a formidable power, but it also does seem to be run by really seriously intelligent people who are capable of that kind of long-term planning. That, it can be brutal in its own way, no doubt about it, but there is a thoughtfulness and a sophistication to them that is completely lacking in this country. I think we're just... I was at this presentation by George Soros at the Council on Foreign Relations about, 10 years ago. And Soros started to say that America had shot its wad. And then he stopped himself. He shot his wad. And then everybody laughed. The Council on Foreign Relations in the audience laughed. But I think, Soros was onto something. America does seem to have shot its wad. And it's just like all over. And in some sense, we deserve it. We've been brutalizing the world for a long time, and it's only fair, in some sense, but we got to live here. I've got a 12-year-old kid who's got to live here. It's terrible to live in the midst of this collapsing civilization, but that's really what it feels like. Yeah. And part of the aspect of the collapse is that a lot of people can see it happening, and we don't know what to do about it. Right. We can't stop it. It's just we feel powerless in the face of this mad frenzy of destruction. Right. And we're run by it's no exaggeration to call it a crew of idiots. I had a lot of dispute with Obama and Clinton and all those kind of people, but they were not idiots in the same way. I mean, they had certain class interests, and a certain short-sightedness that comes with those kinds of class interests. But they had some sophistication about the world. This crowd is so profoundly ignorant and in love with their ignorance and trying to destroy universities, just trying to there's a war on knowledge, they're like everything, undermining the census, they want to like turn universities into trade schools. It's just everything is like brutal, vulgar, and stupid. And what are you going to do about it? There were so many problems with American culture, forever. But there was a dynamism to it that made it sometimes worthwhile and charming. And that dynamism all seems gone. It just seems completely rotten and corrupt and falling to pieces. And I don't know. I hope the teachers of West Virginia and the politically engaged members of the millennial generation can save us. But the current ruling class and political class, hopeless.
So you talked a little bit about the tariffs. I'm not super knowledgeable about like global economics. So when you have people in other countries that can work for pennies on the dollar compared to American workers, it makes perfect sense that jobs and industries are getting outsourced. So from a policy standpoint, how do you combat that if it's not tariffs?
Well, the tariffs don't really do much of anything. In the U.S., you can produce steel with very few workers. So the difference in the wages, it's not that big a deal. But we should also be thinking about industries of the future. Like, we don't really need to have 1 million people working in the steel industry. We can have people working building wind turbines or solar panels or high-speed rail and stuff like that. And if we just think about the industries that can generate employment and also perhaps save life on Earth at the same time, it seems to be a much more fruitful way to go than trying to prop up the steel industry. It just seems like a terrible waste of money, time, and energy to try to prevent the decline of something that's in decline so structurally.
Yeah, I wasn't necessarily talking specifically about the steel industry, but any industry that involves industrial labor is susceptible to this. So you can imagine solar panels being the process of making solar panels being an industrial process that can easily be outsourced. So maybe a lot of innovation occurs in America, but then the labor required to produce them could be outsourced, and I can't see how that can be stopped.
Well, if we save money by buying imported products, that leaves us, money to spend on other things. So, there's no reason that service work has to be low-wage work. We have plenty of service work in the country. Most people work in service industries, and 80 or 90% of the private sector labor force is employed in services. There's no reason why retail work has to be so poorly paid. There's no reason why, we have a lot of people in the health field. Some of them are very highly paid, but some of them are very poorly paid. There's no reason that orderlies have to be paid terrible wages. So I think that raising the wages of the service sector would be a much more fruitful approach than trying to save manufacturing industries. There's a romance about manufacturing that people have too, like making stuff is seen as more noble than serving food or something. But we don't have to revere the dirt under the fingernails professions quite the same way that people do.
But there is so much of a division now. Folks that are in private industry are so anti-public workers. And that's something we're all struggling with. I'm a retired teacher.
Yeah.
And over the years, when I first started out as a teacher years ago, people respected teachers, and then all of a sudden teachers became public enemy #1. So it is encouraging to see what's happening, in the right work states and how they're fighting back. But we have a divide amongst the industrial sector versus the public sector workers. We saw that in Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, the whole Rust Belt area. So I don't know if you have any comments or thoughts in that direction.
Well, a couple of things. The war on teachers is a thing in itself, because it's driven by all these people who want to basically bust teachers' unions and make of it years ago, I interviewed this guy, Terry Moe, who's one of the theorists of this education reform movement, a fellow at the Hoover Institution. His passion is replacing teachers with iPads. And I said, at the conclusion of the interview with him, I said, you know, elites send their kids to schools like St. Anne's in Brooklyn and Sidwell Friends in Washington, where they have small classes and everything's really crunchy and progressive, and they don't do all this standardized testing, they don't have iPads teaching the kids. And his responsibility, he said, well, sure, everything's better when you're an elite. But yeah, this war on teachers is a fascinating thing. I think it's partly the war on knowledge, but also partly because the vision that elites have for the future of the country is that most people will be in crappy, low-wage jobs. And they don't need to be educated. In fact, it can be dangerous if they are. So why pay teachers a decent salary if they're just teaching kids how to work in McDonald's or get ready for their prison cell? That's partly this loss of any kind of faith in the future. It's just, and if you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics projections for job growth over the next decade, they do these every few years, projections for the next decade. And the overwhelming majority of jobs that they project will require at most an associate's degree. Most require a high school diploma and a brief course of on-the-job training. So that's, and of course nobody really talks about this publicly, even though the BLS puts this out every couple of years. It's out there, it's on the public record, it's official statement of the US government. This is the future that's awaiting us. A long term with slow growth, crappy jobs, and this is what, these are US government projections are for a shitty future, basically, for most people. But on the general war against public sector workers, there's a lot of resentment because a lot of public sector workers still have job security and benefits. And to a private sector workforce that has neither of those things, there's nothing but jealousy. And unfortunately, the public sector unions have not really done a very good job of articulating a vision for the broader working class, a political vision. So it's very easy to stoke resentment against them. And this is what happened in Wisconsin. And it's extremely unfortunate that the unions behave this way. Understandable. I mean, their first job is to protect the interests of their membership. But, unless it's part of a broader agenda to raise the dignity and welfare of the working class, there's going to be a whole lot of resentment against it. It's very unfortunate. And it's sometimes, we were talking about this over dinner earlier, it's like the labor movement has a death wish. Like they just have no long-term vision. And you saw the leadership of the teachers unions urging the West Virginia teachers to settle. And same thing in Oklahoma now, I think too. Why? Fight. But back in the 30s when the modern labor movement was founded, there were a lot of communists and Trotskyists. The sit-down strikes were in Flint were largely organized by a bunch of Reds. They purged all those people in the 50s. And there's certainly some very good people working in the rank and file of the labor movement, but the leadership is so deeply conservative that they don't want to rock the boat in the least. And as long as their paychecks don't bounce, they're in fine shape.
Could you, you spent some time talking to Varoufakis, a former Greek finance minister. So you must have some insights about the European ruling class, who must be a little freaked out at the moment. And I'm curious about that. And also, could you comment on what is the real weight, social and economic weight of China in the world today compared to the United States?
Well, on the latter question, that's kind of geeky because you have to, what exchange rate do you use to make the conversion? So if you use market exchange rates, China's not that as big as it may seem. If you use purchasing power parity, which is an effort to find comparable purchasing powers to generate the exchange rates, China is very large. But that aside, there's just no question that China is growing very rapidly, continue to grow rapidly, is really getting more and more technological prowess and more international ambitions. They're spending money like crazy to build this transportation infrastructure in Asia into Europe. and partly into Africa. They have this kind of long-term vision of where they want China to be. At the same time, you know, that kind of foresight and planning is completely lacking in elite circles in the US. So China is profoundly formidable. Who knows, they could have a big smash up. You know, there's like, everybody's always saying their banks are in bad shape and they're gonna crash. And maybe so, but it still does seem like they're the country of the future. And we more and more seem like the country of the past. On the European ruling class, they really seem as blinkered as the American ruling class. Might have nicer suits and better wine, but you know, the inability of the EU to come up with anything like a political coherence, and that absolute German mania for austerity. The former finance minister, Wolfgang Schäuble, liked to quote his grandmother saying that benevolence leads to dissolution. That, you know, that's the mentality of the Germans. You know, it's just nothing but savage tightness. And one of the things that made the American empire so powerful in the post-World War II period was that it was willing to spend some money. You know, they used the Marshall Plan to help Europe's recovery. They thought that stimulating growth abroad would be good for the United States. And they had this really large global vision of how it all worked together. The European elite doesn't seem to have any of that. Of course, they don't, you know, it's not like a common political area the way the US is. And they created the euro, you know, this common currency, without having any kind of common fiscal policy or common government, or even all that much mobility of labor as there is in the US. So, you know, creating this currency first seemed like perhaps they're getting things backwards. But still, if they're going to create this currency, they should have created a much more coherent continent-wide governance structure than they have. So, you know, it just looks like the periphery is getting left behind, and the whole European project looks to be one of just a few of the states around Germany. And it just doesn't seem like it's got the feeling of a long-term strategy about it. Yep.
I'm going to take us a little way from Trump and the current situation. I've been reading a lot about algorithms and how sophisticated they're getting, and you know, anything from self-driving trucks to the medical, you know, doctors being able to diagnose, or not doctors, but machines being able to diagnose. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that, if you agree with, if it's a problem vis-a-vis labor, and what we might, you know, just any of your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, some of it seems like a repetition of anxieties about automation that have plagued us for like 200 years. And just, you know, this happens like every generation. There's some technology that's going to make us all irrelevant to the world of production. It hasn't happened yet. There's certainly a lot of enthusiasm about artificial intelligence. It's funny that I get all this anxiety about Cambridge Analytica and all these clever algorithms for manipulating the election results. They got an awful lot of stuff wrong. If you go and take the personality test that inspired Cambridge Analytica's work by this guy at Cambridge University, I can't remember his name, but he's the guy that Cambridge Analytica ripped off to come up with these things. So it's like, I think the website is called something like Apply Special Sauce. But it will read your Facebook profile and come up with a personality analysis based on your likes. And it's just nonsensical. So, I mean, everybody's going on about how the dastardly genius of Cambridge Analytica manipulated the election in favor of Trump. And you look at this nonsense, and it's like, no, I mean, they, like, because I like the Ramones as one kind of person, and because I like Bach as another kind of person, like, none of it made any sense. So, like, I don't know what kind of message they would target to me. Like, you know, like Joe Ramone playing the Well-Tempered Clavier. I don't know what it would. But so So there's an awful lot of, people sort of lose all their critical faculties when the word algorithm gets presented. So I think, it makes a difference. Certainly, I guess self-driving cars will happen sooner or later, or, woman got killed by an Uber. It's maybe just collateral damage in the course of technological progress. But I'm just really skeptical that it's going to be as radically transformative as a lot of people say. And one of the reasons for this is there's just no growth to speak of in productivity. Now, if we're having all this great technological revolution now, you would see rapid gains in productivity underway, and they're none. The productivity growth is just barely above zero. And it's actually lower now. Trend productivity growth is lower now than it was during the period of the lamented productivity slowdown in the 70s and 80s. You can say there are measurement problems, or maybe there's this delay till it's going to kick in and all this business, but there was one period in the late 1990s where you saw really rapid acceleration of productivity growth, and that all faded within about 5 years. So employment growth now is actually higher than it should be, given the rate of GDP growth. This is another way of saying productivity growth is slow. So something's missing. There's all this talk about this great productivity revolution that's supposedly happening, and this great technological revolution that's happening. But it doesn't seem to be visible anywhere except in the hype machine. And look at what are they doing with all this stuff right now. So we go back to the late 90s, the dot-com bubble. And I wrote a book about after that thing blew up. But I spent a lot of time studying the dot-com bubble and the technological revolution and the productivity acceleration. And there's a lot of really grandiose rhetoric around it. It's going to change the way we work. It's going to end the business cycle. It's going to reduce social hierarchies. It's going to make work fun. It's going to be like peace, love, and understanding. And it's going to be really groovy. And there are like really grand claims of what the internet was going to do. It's just going to make the earthly paradise was upon us. And it didn't quite happen that way. But there was something compelling about the rhetoric. What are we doing now? We're getting new ways to hail cabs and order lunch. It's really, it's not really all that magical. And then, Airbnb, so people can rent out of their bed. Okay, it's nice, but it's just not profoundly transformative in the way that the late 90s technological revolution was advertised to be. And there was a utopian quality to it, too. It did speak to people's desire for meaningful work and flatter hierarchies and more fun in life. We've got none of that now. There's none of that good feeling at all. This is an era of bad feelings, and I would really like to. I'd like to see some better feelings, please. Yeah.
I was going to go back to the issue of the decline of the ruling class, and it would appear that we have the rise of finance. I mean, that other period was dominated, I think, as I recall, by industrial capital, and it seems that there was increasing difficulty finding places, markets, and places to invest, given the nature of how the market system works. And so what do you do with all of this money? And it seems that we have developed this financial class that basically spends its time as salesmen and money men moving money around. And they have been, as I understand it, and even in terms of reading it, is that they are a much larger part of the economy than they were previously. And I'm wondering whether the culture of those people and the nature of the fact that they don't make anything, all they do is basically try to manipulate money, creates a culture of the kind of madness you're talking about. And just kind of related to that is, and related to the idea of using tariffs and so forth is, the fundamental problem is we're reaching what appears to be the late state of capitalism. And increasingly it's unable to find effective ways of utilizing massive people. And they're really, tariffs, whatever, these are not the solution to that kind of problem.
Well, just on that last point, they are using masses of people. the share of the adult population that's employed in the U.S. now is slightly lower than it was before the financial crisis. But it's basically back to where it was. And you know, the unemployment rate is just above 4%, and they're going to have a lot of asterisks explaining why that's perhaps not quite as low as it seems. I don't know, but the worker is not obsolete. Capitalists still need workers. So this idea that they don't know what to do with all these people, it seems misplaced. They do. There are plenty of people working, and employers constantly complain they can't find the right people, which means they can't find the right people with the wages they want to pay. But on your first point, I totally agree with what you're saying. That you know, that WASP ruling class I was talking about was based in old line industries, big companies. You know, and there was this moment, a very symbolic moment in the early '80s when Boone Pickens, one of the early takeover artists, this guy out of Texas, cowboy oil dude who became a financier, launched an attack on Gulf Oil. He had no money. He had all borrowed money. Gulf Oil, one of the pinnacles of the Northeastern establishment at one point, very much part of that Pittsburgh Mellon crowd, you know, like, the Duquesne Club where they all like went for lunch. And, there was this really nice little world of waspy Pittsburgh corporate elite. Boone Pickens comes in to take over Gulf Oil, and he hires as a banker Morgan Stanley. Morgan Stanley had been Gulf's banker before. So all these old relationships of the old order got thrown out of the window because there was a chance to make money, more money quickly. So like, Morgan Stanley had been Gulf's investment banker for generations. Before that was J.P. Morgan, but Morgan Stanley. Boone Pickens blew that apart. So like all these relationships that they cultivated over the years were sacrificed on the altar of maximum money now. Pickens didn't succeed in getting Gulf, but it did end up getting absorbed by somebody else, I can't remember who. But the point is that to use the jargon of Wall Street, what used to be banking was a relationship became all about the transaction. And that, I think, is a measure of the kind of social world that emerged out of this new structure. All these old relationships, who you roomed with at St. Paul's, you know, and that kind of thing, got replaced by who's going to make me the most amount of money by this afternoon. And that kind of, you know, it creates enormous new fortunes, but it also creates a great deal of instability.
Can I just follow up, but just, I'm responding to this. I asked the question, I misspoke in terms of number of people, but the issue is, are we reaching a stage of capitalism where it's finding increasing difficulty, you know, creating a sustainable, economic, stable society? I mean, are we reaching a different stage here? I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's weird because, you know, look at profitability. Profitability is high. So you'd think if profits are high, that investment should be high. Like you say, oh, you know, get big returns, I can invest more. But they're not doing it. They're not investing. Instead, they're taking the money and running. So this is like, you know, the model. We're in the take the money and run economy right now. And whether it's some, you know, narrowly defined economic issue of profitability and rates of return versus risk and all this business, or a different consciousness among the capitalist class of like, I don't want to be bothered with all that risky stuff, I just want my money now. It produces the same results. It's just like, it's like, I just want that money, and I'm not going to invest. And I know everybody hates Elon Musk, and I understand why. You know, Tesla's an abomination in many ways, all those, but there aren't many capitalists like that who really try to do dramatically innovative things. I don't know, I don't know whether they've lost their nerve, but you know, the whole rationale for all their wealth is supposed to be it's a reward for the risks they're taking. They're not interested in taking risks. You know, they're taking risks with our lives, the way they're running the climate. But they're not really interested in those kinds of big bets on like potentially transformative products and technologies. And I think you know, like I said, you can have sort of narrowly economic explanations of it, but I think there's also kind of a cultural, political angle to it, which is just capitalism, especially in this country and in Europe, have reached a certain senescence, and it just seems to be, you know, as what is it the North Korean called Trump a dotard? You know, this is the economy of dotards now. Oh yeah. Yeah.
I was sort of thinking as you were talking, because the title is the sort of a strategy of decline, and then the political economy, and your analysis of the
Well,
political.
I provided the title before I knew what I was going to say,
So
don't hold me to it.
anyway, I'm not going to hold you to it, but I do. But we've sort of been kicking around some of the ideas. As I understand it, in your argument about the economy was that there's a kind of central political, economic faction that's also got the government, that is committed to various kinds of either finance capital, as this gentleman suggested, or deep money of the Koch network.
Right.
And they don't have too much of a vision about society beyond strip it
Right.
and make money. So I
The
wonder-
market will solve all.
Yeah, they believe that. And I wonder if the sort of the turbulence that we see, the lack of a kind of long-term vision, comes from that. In a sense, the ruling class, if you put it that way, their vision is the most for us and the hell with the rest.
Yeah, that's,
Yeah.
yeah. I couldn't put it
So
better
that's the
myself.
force you're facing. or
Yeah,
we're
this is
facing.
it.
Yeah.
You know, and I think, you know, the Goldman Sachs crowd is a little more sophisticated than that, and not so politically rabid as you know, the Koch crowd.
And pushing away all governmental control. That's, I mean, that's what comes out of
Yeah,
the mayor book
yeah.
on dark
Yeah,
money.
yeah, absolutely.
But that's like a 40-year strategy.
Yeah.
probably.
Yeah, I was a little late getting to that mayor book, but I read it last summer. I said, oh my God, this really is the key to the Republican Party and the Trump branch of it. You know, it's just like, these guys just, you know, well, as Margaret Thatcher said long ago, there's no such thing as society. That's where, that they're in more extreme version of that. Yeah.
All right, so just to follow up on what was just said, there is a long-term strategy in place from the people who bring us this attitude of take the money and run now. It's not just this habit that has been formed of just to the hell with everyone, to the hell with everything, just get as much as we can right now. That's part of a vision for the future, because they know the implications of that action on society as a whole, correct?
Well, I'm not sure of that part. But, you know, you look at somebody like Wilbur Ross. He's just a money man. You know, he just like, he's one of those take the money and run guys. The Koch brothers are serious political actors. You know, they have a vision. I know somebody who met David Koch sometime in the mid-70s, and Koch told him then, this is a project of 40 years. So, and here we are 40 years later, and, you know, they've gotten a lot of their way. So they do have that, that kind of ability to plan for the long term, but then they don't really give much thought to what kind of society that creates. Or whether that really is the kind of society that can sustain its own reproduction over the long term. And I don't see how you can launch these kinds of attacks, undermine the public sector, undermine any notion of social solidarity, or any faith in the future, or anything like that. I don't see how you can run an economy on that kind of foundation over the long term. So, you know, they have a strategy for getting done what they want to get done, but I don't think they've really thought through, or don't really care to, the kind of world that it creates.
They just
This
want to
war
sit
of
on
each
top
against
of it.
all.
No matter what type of heap of crap it is, they want to sit on the
Right.
top of it and control what happens
Yeah.
below that.
Well, they want to keep it, you know,
Don't
keep
be
the crowd
far
away
enough.
as far as possible. In
Don't
their
wanna
gated
smell it.
communities. You know, like Peter Thiel and his wants to move to an island offshore, or, you know, go to this remote corner of New Zealand or whatever. There's this weird interest in secession from a part of that
That's why
crowd
I
too.
find the Emirates interesting, all the investment in that strip of land.
Yeah,
India. India is all walled off communities, you know, gated communities with no
Yeah.
interaction with the common folk.
Yeah, well, Latin America has had that a lot, but now we're, you know, it's coming here.
Spreading everywhere, yeah.
Yeah, it's an appalling and frightening vision. And you know, I've said several times, like their inability to think about the climate crisis is just terrifying. And rather than like try to argue it, they just say, oh, it's all nonsense, right? There's something about, you know, there was something about bourgeois rationality in this heyday, something appealing about it. You know, they're able to, like, it was instrumental and perhaps didn't create a beautiful society, but they're able to think about inputs and outputs and consequences.
They missed a lot.
What the meaning of things is, and, you know, but now it's just all, I've got mine and fuck you is what it comes down to.
No stewardship,
Yeah,
absenteeism.
yeah,
Dumbing down.
yeah.
Yeah, this is kind of an offshoot. You know, we have at the same time under tandem the rise of the surveillance mechanisms from the FBI, fusion centers, from data warehousing, from keyword searches. And so this is running in tandem, this upgrade of intense surveillance, intense FBI watching, intense this kind of stuff. Do you see that as, how do you connect the dots between that and the rise of the ruling class? Is this going to end up in some kind of martial law, or do we not even need it because people are getting accustomed to knowing that there's this huge surveillance network going on?
That's a good question. I mean, one of the things about the panopticon was that it changes people's behavior, knowing they're being observed. So, you know, if you know you're observed, you're going to act different. You know, there are cameras everywhere.
That's like Facebook. You act a certain way on Facebook.
Yeah. You know, my life is an open book on Facebook. Like, you could find out everything about me with about 10 minutes on my Facebook page. And, you know, I guess I should care, but I don't exactly. But on the other hand, you know, I don't have to worry about keeping a job or, you know, the consequences of my being doxxed are very good. But yeah, the surveillance stuff is frightening. And I guess Yasha will be over here, what, in a month or so? And Yasha's argument in that book, among other things, is that the internet has been about surveillance from the first. And he traces the origin of the internet to the battlefield sensors in Vietnam, when the Pentagon created all these sensors and cameras and all this stuff. They're supposed to be spying on the movements of Viet Cong and the Vietnamese soldiers. And then they'd have to aggregate this information, send it back to Washington, and do something with it. And this is when the Pentagon said, oh man, this network information stuff can be really powerful. And so then they went and created the internet. So the idea that somehow Facebook is an exception or an innovation, like no, this has been like this for the entire history of the internet. It's all about surveillance from the first. You know, on the other hand, this is not a very rebellious population. And when people talk about the threat of fascism in the US, I think, well, who needs fascism? You know, we have a very pacific population for the most part, and we have these private episodes of extreme violence, but they're not like organized in a coherent or political way. In Germany, you know, in the 1920s and early 30s, you had to worry about communists. There were a lot of communists and socialists all over the place. And the ruling class really felt that they were going to be expropriated. They felt that here too, and so we had the New Deal instead of fascism. But I much prefer a New Deal to fascism. But you know, there's nothing like that now. You know, they know everything. I guess they know everything about us. But on the other hand, what they can know about us probably doesn't seem all that interesting. I mean, people's vices are always interesting to me. I want to know what people's vices are. But, you know, like, there's not, like, a whole lot of political plotting going on that the elites have to worry about. So, you know, they've got all this information. God knows what they're doing with it.
Sean in the back is
had his hand
Yeah.
up for many a day.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I'm standing. I wanted to go back to, you mentioned North Korea earlier, and with the appointment of Bolton, who just like 2 months ago wrote about like let's just start bombing North Korea in like the Wall Street Journal, and yet at the same time we've seen, it's, and again the North, they're not obviously Kim Jong-un isn't an irrational actor, but there are these bits, where he comes out and he seems to be willing to make a deal and stuff like that. But the diplomacy that was happening there with the new president of South Korea seemed really promising. And then out goes McMaster and in comes Bolton, and then to your point, right? Like Mattis suddenly is the Mad Dog Mattis is suddenly the voice of reason from the Pentagon. It's I mean my father was a Marine. I got to stand in Mattis's presence at one point.
Oh, really?
Did
you feel like a mad dog?
I wish I was a little bit older at the time and had been a little bit wittier or something like that. But alas, so I guess my question is what comes of this, like this, again, there was this progress that seemed to be happening on the part of South Korea with North Korea, and now, now it's Mattis and Bolton, who are gonna, and Pompeo at the State Department. What happens? What happens? Now.
I'm looking at that cross over there.
Yeah, right.
I don't know if it belongs in a gravestone or something I should pray to. But I don't know. I mean, there used to be a degree of rationality to the heads of state that seemed to be lacking in the current crowd. So, I don't know. For years I never took the threat of nuclear war seriously because I thought the U.S. and the Soviet Union are run by people who may be brutal and awful in a lot of ways, but they don't want to bring about the destruction of the world. And with this crowd, I'm not entirely convinced of that. So, I don't think we're going to end up a global nuclear conflagration. But then you also have these crazy Democrats trying to gin up things with Russia. Like, Christ, what is up with this? It's like the Cold War all over again, except it's not about anything. The Cold War is about how to organize an economic and political system. And there are many, many things wrong with the Soviet Union. We can make a long list of all of it, but it was a living example that there's an alternative way to organize society. So that was, and I know Noam Chomsky likes to talk about how it's just about power politics, but that may be Noam's anti-communist work. I think now we have this revival of this weird zombie Cold War rhetoric about nothing, and I don't understand precisely what it's all about, but you see these Democrats who are like, who was it? Some big Democrat said recently that this election meddling, whatever that was the equivalent of Pearl Harbor. I mean, really, are you crazy? But so you have, on one side you've got, McMaster, you got Trump and Bolton and these characters wanting to go after Iran and North Korea. Right. And the other side, the other party wants to go after Russia. And now Bolton has added Russia to the axis of evil.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I don't know, it just seems like they're just heading towards the cliff and pressing down the accelerator.
Yeah.
It's appalling and frightening, and I just can't figure out what sense any of this makes.
Do you think, I guess, just a quick follow-up, do you think the diplomacy that was, on the part of South Korea, do you think it prevails, or do you think that the U.S. puts its thumb on the scale?
Well, if we're up to the Koreans, both sets of Koreans, both North and South, I think they would like to stay alive. But like half of North Korea could be South Korea could be wiped out in an instant. And Trump seems to be willing to sacrifice. Bannon, is much more sense than anything. I mean, something you can't do that. You'd lose 10 million Koreans. Right? It's hard to argue with it. I kind of miss Bannon. Well, he's awful and horrible in many ways, but there was something in his head. It's like weird and sick in a lot of ways, but there was
No,
some
no.
kind of resemblance of a thought process there.
No.
God, no,
Boy,
the
this
rest
is
of
very interesting nostalgia.
yes, nostalgic for the days of Steve Bannon. But then, you know, Mooch. I miss Mooch, too. Yeah.
Maybe this is simplistic, but in the last year and plus of Trump and seeing all these things that you've been laying out and wondering why is there no different, voices being expressed even in the elite. But then the market just was going up until recently and then turned around. Do you read any significance into that? Does that filter out some people with, I think it will filter out maybe the supporters who are the working class supporters of a Trump regime as the market goes down. But does it have no real effect among the unity of the ruling class?
Well, a couple of things. One, the working class supporters of Trump have no money in the market at all. Most people.
But they'll be hurt.
Maybe. Half the population doesn't have any retirement account at all.
Right.
So when Trump would go around saying, how's your 401k doing? He was speaking to, I don't know, like the 50th to the 80th percentiles of the income distribution. But the market was happy with Trump because, as I said, when they were initially worried, there was this little period after his election, they said, oh my God, what's going to happen? And then they saw tax cuts and deregulation. It's off to the races. So and the market had been rising for 7 years going into that, and then it got another year. So by most measures, the stock market is very highly valued. But most measured against profits or GDP or its own historical prices, whatever. It's very highly valued. So it's very vulnerable to a fall. And at the same time, coming out of the Great Recession, the Fed was pumping all this money into the financial system through quantitative easing, trying to stimulate the economy. It didn't really do much of that, but it certainly stimulated the financial markets. That's not going into reverse. The Fed is withdrawing that stimulus, raising interest rates. And then the enthusiasm over tax cuts and deregulations foundered on the tariffs and the increasingly nationalistic tenor of a lot of Trump's talking, and the markets don't like that stuff at all. So you put that combination together of really high valuations, rising interest rates, and anxieties about the political leadership, and that's a recipe for a lot of turbulence in the market. And for the first year of his presidency, Trump just couldn't celebrate the stock market enough. It was his daily report card on how great he was. He's been very quiet about it for the last couple of months now that it's been stumbling. By most conventional measures, it doesn't look like there's anything like a recession near, but we're going to have one in the next year or two or so. God knows when that happens. I don't know what. We've got tax cuts mean that $1 trillion deficits are the norm now.
Yeah.
And even the United States government is going to have a hard time raising $1 trillion a year. If we have a recession, they're going to have to raise $1.5 trillion a year. There's no ammunition for any kind of fiscal stimulus. They can't. So this is just a tremendous waste in every sense. So we're going to go into a possible recession with absolutely no chance of fiscal policy and absolute dolts running the economy. The new chair of the Fed is, he's a competent character, but the rest of them, the Treasury Secretary is an idiot. Trump is a complete moron. So if we have any kind of financial turbulence or economic turbulence, which seems inevitable at some point, the guys in the driver's seat are should be pulled over for a breathalyzer test. I don't know. It's really it looks really grim to me. I don't know where I ended up in this cul-de-sac of mood. Find a way out.
Teachers, the teachers.
Wait, you should.
Yes.
Just a couple of things. You mentioned that you really didn't see a reason for, that they're causing conflict with North Korea and Russia. But those two countries have massive oil reserves or other natural resources that seems to me that's the only reason why we launch these invasions, is to confiscate their, control and confiscate their oil or whatever minerals they have. And the same thing with Venezuela. You know, now we start to talk about Venezuela being an enemy, and they're the only other major country with massive oil reserves.
Yeah, they have massive oil reserves. People used to joke, though, in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq, that if its principal product was kimchi, we wouldn't be invading.
Right.
I don't know that North Korea has all that much in the way of resources the United States want, but what they have is a threat of nuclear weapons. And the same thing with Iran. The United States does not want countries it does not have good feelings about to develop nuclear weapons. Because they know that if a country develops nuclear weapons, we can't push them around.
But Trump all of a sudden, I mean, I just don't think that Trump is controlling anything. I think he's being fed this information. Now he's got the entire military working for him. I mean, how would, as you called them, an ignoramus, know to even put these players into place? So I don't think Trump and his team will have any control over anything that's happening right now.
Well,
Really
somebody
don't.
does. I don't know who.
There's always somebody.
I mean, he's got the entire military that's carried over from the previous administration now in the State Department.
There's nobody left in the State Department. Yeah, like Trump, it's really funny to read Trump bragging about how the military is great again. Even though it's basically the same one that when he took office. But I think, you know, the stuff about North Korea and Iran, who was it? Michael, what's his name? Horrible, ghoulish hawk. Can't remember his name.
Ignatian?
No.
Ignatieff?
Not the Canadian guy. Oh, God, I can't remember now. But he said in the run-up to the Iraq War, every 10 years or so, the United States has to take some small, crappy little country and throw it against the wall to show who's boss. Didn't work very well with Iraq. But they seem to be ready to try it now with North Korea or maybe Iran, I don't know. But you can't throw a crappy little country against the wall if it has nuclear weapons. So they just don't want that to happen. I remember I was once interviewing a guy from a radio show who's at the Council on Foreign Relations. And he's going on about the nuclear threat of Iraq. I can't remember what country it was, about 15 years ago. And I said, I understand. Israel has like somewhere between 100 and 400 nuclear weapons. That's okay. But Iraq or Iran can't have any. And I said, what's the standard? Is it just that the U.S. likes a country or not?
Yeah.
And he said, this is not a serious interview. I'm going to hang up now. But I think that basically is it. You know, Israel's on our side, and they do our work, and we do their work. And they can have a couple of hundred nuclear weapons, but North Korea is not, and they can't have one. That's what it is. But Russia, the Russian thing makes no sense. Russia has been a formidable power for, you know, a long, long, long time. The only other country that had, you know, a nuclear arsenal comparable to the United States, there's just no way the United States could seriously mess with Russia unless we had a death wish for the entire planet. But that seems to be what Rachel Maddow is after now.
Doug, why don't we take one more?
Okay, one more.
And ask the question, and then we can wrap it up.
Okay.
So just to ask you to expand more on Iran, it seems like the strongest, most coherent force that is backing, or like, once the Iran deal is in place, is this like conflagration of European capital that wants into Iranian markets. And now with Bolton in charge, and with Mattis with his own personal relationship with Iran, like how much of a hope do we have with that, you know, Iran deal lasting and sort of American relations improving and Iran entering the world market?
Close to none, really. And we're very much closer to Israel than now, but certainly Obama was still enemy of Israel. But there's a very interesting bit in, Mark Lander, New York Times correspondent, wrote an interesting book about the relationship between Hillary and Obama. Came out a couple of years ago. In it, he said that Obama came into office really wanting a wholesale renovation of the U.S.-Israel relationship. And the entire foreign policy establishment blocked it, and including Hillary, when she was the Secretary of State. And then, towards the end of his term in office, Obama and the people around him were complaining about the blob, this foreign policy apparatus of think tanks and pundits and experts and former recession analysts who are the disciplinary mechanism in foreign policy. So that blob is very anti-Iran and pro-Israel. And certainly Obama did nothing really to undermine the U.S.-Israel relationship. But there's obviously a turn towards a much more Netanyahu-friendly line towards Israel. Israel wants Iran, would like to see it wiped off the face of the earth, I think. And people like Bolton are totally behind that agenda. I think Hillary would have looked for an excuse to scrap the Iran deal too. It was one of the better things that Obama did was to negotiate that, and they want it undone.
Oh, yeah.
Don't even foul name. Yeah, so I don't know, it looks really, really bad. And I think the animus towards Iran is so strange. I mean, it's not the greatest regime in the world, but it's certainly far from the most horrible. Our dear friends in Saudi Arabia are far worse.
Saudis and the Israelis are our best buddies.
Yeah.
Israel's most adamant about Iran's regime change than anyone else.
Yeah. But yeah, that looks really bad.
To wrap it up, I mean, I wonder whether you can go back to that sort of Scylla and Charybdis of, on the one hand, everything has changed. On the other hand, sort of continuity as it's always been, and offer just a sort of closing thought on, is this a moment when, because the asset strippers were there under Obama. I mean, this, as you said, it's a 40-year process. The finance has not changed. The underlying economy hasn't transformed, unless 2008 somehow marked some radical rupture from the past that actually is going to produce a new political class. I mean, is this a moment where we've got a truly awful administration that kind of goes hand in hand with a weird right populist swing around the world in lots of ways that could very easily reverse itself back to an Obama-Clinton sort of friendly thing and continue in that line with a vague neoliberal project? Or are we in new territory in some way? I mean, maybe a few closing thoughts on just that opening prompt that you gave us about what's the same and what's different going forward?
Well, I'll return to the way I resolved that opening thing, which is it's the same, only worse.
With a junta.
And a somewhat longer version of that would be that in some ways things really did change in 2008. And one of the things that really changed, well, I mentioned the one that people could not borrow as freely as they used to compensate for stagnating incomes. So that really creates a serious economic problem in terms of creating demand, but also a political one. It's just like if people have to rely on their incomes for their their material standards of living, that's not enough. And so a lot of the sour mood and the bitterness that produced Trump is a result of that. That constraint in their borrowing power and the constraint in their living standards. But the other thing that got destroyed is that center-left neoliberal politics. So we're seeing a rejection of that all across Europe. And in the United States, that's what Hillary embodies that. The leadership of the National Democratic Party embodies that. And they're just terrified of the possibility of a left turn that was represented. What Sanders exposed was that there's a large constituency for that kind of left turn, especially among younger people. As I said earlier, are about the only hope I have for the world now. And yeah, that we just can't go back to that. And so you see, one of the arguments that was used against Berlusconi, for example, in Italy, by the center left was, yeah, we may suck, but that guy's worse. And that was kind of an argument for Hillary too. Like, you know, look at this frightful guy, you know, but these frightful guys are selling something.
Right.
They're selling some kind of spurious salvation or an outlet for a way to say fuck you to the world. And the Brexit was the same thing. People didn't really think necessarily what Brexit meant, but it was a way to say fuck you to the London elites. So all that kind of, you know, Blairism and whoever all those miscellaneous Italians were, you know, like, and now we're seeing things, you know, this Macron in France was supposed to be the deliverance from the fascists, and here he is like breaking unions and attacking the welfare state and like increasing amounts of power in the presidential office. Yeah, I think that whole center-left model is dead now, and so the right populists have moved into that vacuum. And unless some kind of left can present itself as an alternative to that, we just seem to be in this world of increasing xenophobia and inwardness and bitterness and violence. And you know, we're back to the old forced choice, socialism or barbarism.
Why don't we wrap it up?